From a pile of bison skulls to a giant manta ray, all the way to a chilling war photo and one of the strangest sights I've ever seen. Here is part 2 of the top 10 unsettling pictures from history you weren't meant to see. Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have a pile of bones. During the 19th century, bison were hunted so much that they were actually quite close to being extinct, and by the mid-1880s there were only a few hundred left. Hides were prepared and then shipped off so that they could be made into leather, but usually the bones, or really anything other than the hide, was just left to decay as it wasn't useful to the hunters. The hunting of bison was so widespread and overwhelming that even the US Army sanctioned and endorsed the slaughter of herds of bison. The federal government was promoting it for a variety of reasons, including to lessen a food and material source for the indigenous peoples. The US government was even paying a bounty for each bison skull, and military commanders were ordering troops to kill bison, not for them to eat, but just so that the indigenous couldn't. That story, coupled with the sheer mass amounts of skulls seen in this photo, is exactly what makes it so exceptionally unsettling. These bones would likely be on their way to become fertilizer. In our number 9 spot today we have the Great Manta. In 1933, a New York silk manufacturer named A.L. Kahn was on a nice little vacation in Florida when he honestly accidentally caught something remarkable. His anchor line, by mistake, caught onto a giant manta ray. After a struggle and several hours, Kahn was able to get this actually enormous fish ashore. This monster was somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000 pounds and was 20 feet and 5 inches in width. For reference, there are other giant manta rays, but they usually grow to be around 13 to 14 feet wide, not 20 and a half. This photo is showing a taxidermy version of the fish which Kahn used to bring around to exhibitions to show off his accidental catch. In an article from the December 10th, 1933 issue of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch's Sunday magazine, Kahn is quoted as saying, quote, "Fishing is a lot of fun when you catch the fish. And sometimes it's fun even when you don't, but when the fish catches you." In our number 8 spot today we have the swimsuits. This is a photo that comes to us from the 1920s, and it shows just one of the many extremely important jobs that the quote beach patrol of the day had. Yes, they went around measuring the length between a woman's knee and the bottom of her swimsuit because God forbid she showed too much leg at the beach. In the 1920s, bathing suits began to become something that went through changes and fads, and of course this evolution to more form-fitting, less material swimwear caused a lot of controversy in the day. There were then strict dress codes implemented at places like resorts and country clubs, and even directors of public beaches had them, thus the beach patrol. There were fines for violations and sometimes even imprisonment. In the Washington Post in 1907 there was a photo of 2 women in bathing suits being escorted by an officer with a caption, quote, "These apologies for skirts endanger the morals of the children. The police must interfere and stop the outrageous proceedings." In most cases, these sorts of rules really only affected the women of the time, and sometimes women were even required to wear stockings under their bathing suits. I'm just saying, with my attitude, I would have not done well in the 1920s. There was even one beach who had a tailor go around and stitch up swimsuits that they felt weren't up to the dress code. In our number 7 spot today we have the advertisement. This is a photo that comes to us from a time of World War II, and it shows a terrifying ad. The sign reads, "These men didn't take their Atabrine," and at first I had absolutely no idea what that was. Turns out Atabrine is the first synthetic form of quinine which was used by the US military to fight malaria in the South Pacific during the war. It is estimated that as many as 2/3 of the troop fell ill with malaria. This sign is said to have been posted outside of a military hospital in New Guinea and was meant to serve as a warning for those who didn't take the medicine, warning that the skulls on top would be the fate that awaited them. Perhaps a little dark, but creative and likely effective nonetheless. At the very least, the ad is quite clear. In our number 6 spot today we have the Ferris Wheel of Hate. This is a photo that, honestly, I don't even know what to say about it. It's gross, it's weird, it's upsetting, and it's honestly just so stupid. For a long time this photo went under the radar as the photographer who took it didn't share it with the paper, but when it resurfaced 65 years later, it spread like wildfire, and for a lot different reasons than it would have back then, thankfully, but it also reveals some of those blind spots in history that we have. This photo comes from April of 1926, and it shows some members of the KKK just enjoying a day at an amusement park with many of them on a Ferris Ferris wheel. I wish this was one of those times where something went horribly wrong and the whole thing came crashing down, but unfortunately that likely isn't what happened on this day, and now we just have this relic that shows us the insane power and influence that this hate group had during this time. While this photo is very dark, it's an important part of history to remember. Also, before we move on, let's just take a second to talk about how stupid they all look. Like, we gotta wear our little matching outfits to the Ferris wheel. In our number 5 spot today, we have early plastic surgery. This photo, well, rather these two photos side by side, show a man named Walter Yeo, and he was the first person to receive the, at the time advanced, plastic surgery procedure called the skin flap. Sounds disgusting. He received this procedure in 1917, and at the time, since it was so advanced, it was only used for very serious things, like for someone who was wounded in battle, which is exactly what had happened to Walter. He was a soldier in the Battle of Jutland during the First World War. Walter was actually a sailor, and he was manning the guns aboard the HMS Warspite, and while doing this, he sustained facial injuries that included the loss of his upper and lower eyelids. In the end, he needed a couple more operations, but he was even able to return to service for a little while before being medically discharged. After this, he lived his life until he reached the age of 70 years old. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Hindenburg. This is a photo that was taken during what is now known as the Hindenburg disaster. It is commonly known that blimps, or these kinds of floating airships, use helium in them to float through the air, and it's important to note that this helium isn't the choice because it's the only option, but rather it's one of the safest options because it isn't extremely volatile. Because of a US ban on the exportation of helium at the time, i.e. the Helium Control Act of 1925, although the Hindenburg was designed to use helium, because of a lack of it available, on the day of the Hindenburg disaster, the much more flammable hydrogen was used instead. This led to a complete disaster. When the Hindenburg floated off on May 6, 1937, it disastrously caught fire during its flight with 97 people on board. Sadly, due to the fire, there were 35 casualties on board the flight that day. It is an absolutely horrendous situation, but it does teach us all a very valuable lesson. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Falls. This is a photo of Annie Edison Taylor when she was 63 years old in 1901. The barrel she is posing beside is the one that she sealed herself up inside of to then become the first person to survive a trip over Niagara Falls. Why did she do this? Well, for money, of course. Annie was widowed and spent a lot of time bouncing between different jobs, but after having been burned out of her home and losing money that she had invested with a clergyman, she ended up sadly falling on some hard times, and this is what led her to the Falls. The barrel she used was custom made, and it was constructed of oak and iron and padded with a mattress. It wasn't exactly easy to get this whole plan set up, and it ended up being delayed several times, mostly because people were afraid to be a part of this mission that was likely sending Annie to her death, and I truly don't blame them at all. On October 24th, 1901, her 63rd birthday, Annie climbed in the barrel with her heart-shaped pillow and was set adrift. The river currents carried the barrel over the Canadian Horseshoe Falls, and rescuers reached her barrel shortly after. She was alive and escaped with little to no injuries aside from a gash on her head. While her survival is great news, it's important to include what Annie had to say about the entire situation after, which was, quote, "If it was with my dying breath, I would caution anyone against attempting the feat. I would sooner walk up to the mouth of a cannon knowing it was going to blow me to pieces than make another trip over the falls." So don't try this at home, is what she's saying. In our number 2 spot today, we have War is Hell. This is a photo of a soldier that was taken during the Vietnam War. The soldier has a hand-scribed note on their helmet that reads, quote, "War is hell," and I truly cannot even imagine. In 1954, the US entered the war to support South Vietnam against the regime in North Vietnam, as well as their allies in the South. This war lasted for 2 decades, and it claimed more than 3 million lives, mostly those of Vietnamese civilians. There are many powerful, disturbing, and unsettling photos from this war, many of which I would consider too graphic to put here on YouTube. There is something about the brightness of the eyes of the soldier that sits in contrast with the rest of this dark photo that really make it stand out. For a while, the identity of this soldier was left a mystery, but after some years, Fran Chafin Morrison revealed that the soldier was her late husband, Larry Wayne Chaffin. Larry served for a year in the 173rd Brigade, beginning in May 1965, and when this this photo was taken, he was just 19 years old. He did end up being discharged from the army and was able to return home to his wife. He sadly ended up passing away at the young age of 39, thought to be because of complications due to the exposure to Agent Orange, but his legacy has lived on. There's an incredible photo of his grandson who looks strikingly similar to his grandfather, holding this exact portrait. In our number 1 spot today, we have the cross. This photo comes to us from 1960 and it shows Martin Luther King Jr. along with his infant son at the time removing a cross that had been burnt on his front lawn. This photo is important and powerful for quite a few reasons. Firstly, it's just a glimpse into what Mr. King would have dealt with every single day for many years. It is clear by his almost nonchalant look that this isn't something new or surprising. It's also important to note, however, that this look isn't one of acceptance or content, or of someone who is unbothered, but instead it's the look of someone who continually chooses to rise above, someone who chooses to remain calm and cool in the face of adversity, the leader of a movement. As a Reddit user, 1945 Best Year put so well, quote, "Here he's a father, a man with a family whose lives are being threatened. He isn't hysterical or obviously afraid, and his towering figure literally rooting out the undesirable foe has been done in any number of war propaganda posters, but he's still sympathetic. He deserves the security of knowing that home will be safe for his children like anybody else." Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!